And I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee this morning, especially with some of the weather challenges, but I especially want to welcome my constituent, Mr. Bill Schultz, who is in from Mattawan, Michigan, and I'm really glad that you were able to make it and to be a part of this. As I indicated last year at our first hearing, oversight is a vital check on any administration's power and on those he or she choose to represent that administration. Today's hearing should not be confused with a debate on climate change, but rather whether the Securities and Exchange Commission has the legal authority to mandate climate disclosures from all companies, and that's, I believe, is going to be the effect. Nearly a century ago, Congress created the SEC to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation. These are timeless goals and objectives, and not to necessarily advance a particular agenda. As we approach the 2-year anniversary of the proposal of the SEC's climate disclosure rule and this subcommittee's year-long investigation into that rule, I think it's prudent to examine the facts. First, the SEC has wildly underestimated the costs the rule will impose on both public and private companies. Instead of conducting a thorough economic analysis, the already overwhelmed Division of Economic and Risk Analysis at the SEC relied on left-leaning environmental activist groups to justify its rulemaking. While the SEC asserts that the rule would cost current reporting companies roughly $10 billion a year, a recent study puts that number at closer to $25 billion a year, with little analysis on how proposed Scope 2 and Scope 3 requirements will impact small businesses who frankly can't afford a compliance department, a legal department. Furthermore, this past fall, the Fifth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals ruled against a separate SEC finalized proposal relating to shareholder or share repurchase disclosure. In that opinion, the court rightfully held that, quote, the SEC acted arbitrarily and capriciously in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act when it failed to respond to petitioners' comments and failed to conduct a proper cost-benefit analysis, close quote. Given the sheer volume, pace, and complexity of rules currently before the SEC, a 9.4% staff vacancy rate as of September 2023, and IG reports citing recruitment and retention challenges, one has to wonder how many finalized rules will ultimately be vacated by the courts. Which leads us to this question. In light of the Supreme Court's ruling of West Virginia versus EPA, does the SEC have congressional authorization to implement rules related to environmental or climate issues? In its ruling, the Supreme Court held that the EPA exceeded its statutory authority, relying on ambiguity as constituting an implicit delegation from Congress. Let's be clear. Congress has not delegated the authority to the SEC to require climate disclosures. The court's decision signals the SEC's authority to develop, finalize, and implement a climate disclosure rule is in jeopardy. And now, frankly, we're waiting on the Supreme Court, who took oral hearings yesterday on the Chevron doctrine. What is the boundaries? And this was about 40 years ago. There was the court ruling establishing that. So we are seeing a court in certainly re-examining that balance between an administration and Congress. So lastly, I want to close where I began, congressional oversight. I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the subcommittee's efforts to conduct oversight of the SEC's climate rule and get answers to many of the questions we hear about and we will be hearing about today in our testimony. Though the SEC has responded to the committee, one might be in awe of the imposing sounding 69,000 pages of documents that they've sent over. The devil is in the details. To date, the Commission has approved only 11,540 pages of responsive, non-public documents to be produced to the committee. That's 16% of the total documents produced. The SEC has flooded our subcommittee with unresponsive documents, including a copy of the rule itself, a copy of Chair Gensler's public testimony before our committee, which I might add I was sitting here for myself, press releases, and the entire public comment file, which of course is public. So given the lack of cooperation and the contents of the material turned over to the committee to date, I can only conclude that Chair Gensler is intentionally slow-walking our investigation. So I'll let those watching draw their own conclusions, but look at those details. So whether the final climate rule is finalized next week or next month, I think we can conclude that the chair has failed to not only convince his fellow commissioners, but the American people. And as we will hear today, he will likely not convince the court. I look forward to hearing from each one of our witnesses. And with that, I will be yielding to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, the ranking member, for 4 minutes.